Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Today we will be talking about Indian-occupied Kashmir and the developments that are taking place there. Now, New Delhi had announced a ban on Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front on Friday, a pro-independence group in Indian-occupied Kashmir, as part of a crackdown on what it calls separatist organizations. Now, Delhi says the JKLF is an unlawful association and it posed a threat to the country's unity and integrity. This has, of course, spurred on more unrest in the valley, and a complete shutdown was also observed on Sunday as a protest against the ban on JKLF. There is obviously a lot of debates going on right now in the sphere of things happening in Jammu and Kashmir, and one of them is the very timing of this ban, and not just on JKLF but on other separatist leaders also, especially in the post-Pulwama context and also in the preparation of the elections coming up in India. Now, first it was the Jamaat-e-Islami, now it is the JKLF. There's also in question the veracity and the following of these leadership roles of the separatist organizations within occupied Kashmir. Is it the youth that is showing disenfranchisement by their role, or there are other forces in play? So to talk about that and more, I'd like to welcome my guests to News. First of all, we have Mr. Sameer Yasir. You're a journalist and you're joining us from Srinagar. Also from Srinagar, we have Mr. Sajjad Lone, who is also a journalist. I'd like to welcome both of you to Newswire today. Of course, the issue in question is a pretty huge one. It is an ongoing conflict in Indian-occupied Kashmir. So I want to come to you, Mr. Sameer. We're seeing this ban on JKLF, on leaders, seeing house arrests, on raids taking place in their houses. What is your take on the timing of this ban on these organizations?
Well, there's one thing which is for sure, like, for example, there's this election coming up in entire India, and, like the BJP, which is governing India particularly at this time, they have been asking, they have been very tough since, they took office in 2014, particularly Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and his entire policy towards Kashmir has been, looking through it through the prism of, if you will, of security, and that's what has been going on from the last 4 years. But particularly about Yasir, Yasir Malik. I mean, he's somebody who has actually fought the dialogue, who renounced violence in 1993 after he was one of those pioneers of this Kashmir struggle, who started the armed movement. And finally, then he thought that this was not going anywhere. He renounced violence. He followed this Gandhian path of non-violence, and ultimately his people were killed in Kashmir Valley. It's not that he has not personally suffered. He has personally suffered also, and also his workers have been killed, for believing in kind of, if you will, a dialogue with the government of India. But ultimately, what happens is he was part of also the dialogue process, which was in the previous NDA government, which was launched at that time. We are actually seeing this crackdown at this moment aligned with India's elections in other parts of the country, because ultimately, they will have to show something, to the electorate of India, that we have been very tough with the Kashmiri separatists. We have been very tough with the Kashmiri people, who actually want to secede, who want to have an independent nation or go with Pakistan. We have been very tough with Hurriyat conference. And recently, one of the investigating agencies, NIA, they said that they have actually recovered $10,000 from Sayyid Ali Shah Geelani's residency, which is not a big amount if you ask people, but at the end of the day, it actually looks, all of it actually is surrounding in one thing. That is,
so it almost feels like they're looking for excuses. I mean, just finding money in one of the leaders' houses, it almost seems as if they're just grabbing on to anything they can to prove that they are not playing their role as a effective organization or a leadership role for the people of Kashmir. Is that the case?
They have their own point of view. They say that, there's this case going on in India, which is called terror funding. And this case was, it was launched years back. And particularly after Pulwama, the crackdown on it actually has intensified in Kashmir Valley. they have been investigating cases of, for example, of hawala money and all these dealings which happen, because conflict is a big economy, it's an industry, and it thrives on certain political social discourses, and that's what their point is, that they are investigating that. But the problem is that it actually looks entirely kind of manufactured, concocted stories, and they have not been able to give, for example, many proofs on certain important issues, while working in Kashmir. And it's not something new. They have been carrying out a huge crackdown on these people who actually they say are aligned with the terror organizations, for example, militant groups, those who are funding them.
Right.
And there have been some businessmen, some leaders, and it actually is largely in Kashmir Valley. If you ask people, right, they will tell you that it's actually kind of New Delhi trying to superimpose itself and say that, that we have been tough on these guys, and telling the people back home, that
right,
we were able to do
We are
this.
playing our role to galvanize votes, obviously. But Mr. Sajjad, let me ask you, when it comes to sort of banning political and religious organization, they're essentially shrinking space for the civilians, the locals of Kashmir, to operate freely, to express their views. And in turn, also these organizations have a role to play on the local youth. What, in your opinion, how does this affect the Hurriyat leadership and in turn the locals?
See, this is very unfortunate that the parties are being banned. There is aghast over the decision in whole valley. The decision, we all know that decision would lead to a shrinking space, because we are in 21st century, and there is, if we talk about other countries, there is huge space for freedom of speech. But this all started in Kashmir on 14 February after a car bomb suicide attack on CRPF convoy on India in Latpur of Jammu and Kashmir. Since then, the government has intensified the crackdown on separatists and their alleged sympathizers. First, the government of India banned the Jamaat Islami, then JKL. So here is complete reset and no space for peaceful organizations. And believe me, this by these activities, India won't achieve anything, because once they leave to, they refuse to talk with the stakeholders. Only then they can. Then we all can reach a solution. If you are just putting the people inside the jails and you are not talking to them, it won't lead you anything. So I believe that there should be.
It's almost like they're trying to strong arm the leaders into accepting the terms and conditions. Mr. Samir, when we talk about these bans on the political and religious organizations representing the local youth and the people, is it when there is a ban and these leaders are put behind jail, does this enable the Indian government to control the masses better, or does it backfire into making the masses more radicalized?
Not really. What we have seen in recent years is that it's a kind of leaderless movement now in Kashmir Valley. The entire ball is, it's in the hands of young teenager boys who actually throng streets, do stone pelting, become militants, and get killed. What I have seen for the last 3 years is that, for example, there are these boys who became militants last year. You had 250 killings of them. If you look at their socio-political profile, they were not really somebody who were actually from the below from the lower ladder of the society. These were people who went to good schools. These were people who went to good universities, but ultimately thought that that they have a place. Kashmir Valley is a home which has been in trouble from last decades now, almost 3 decades now, and there has been no political solution. Ultimately, what happens is whenever India and Pakistan actually come together to talk about Kashmir, you will realize that the violence in Valley actually gets down. It comes down heavily. But there was this, you might know the former Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, he had started these round tables on Kashmir Valley, and there were these confidence building measures happening between India and Pakistan. And one of the issues actually was, to get these Kashmiri militants who are living in Pakistan, get them back to Kashmiri society, let them live a peaceful life, and build a kind of atmosphere in which you could actually try to do something about Kashmir Valley. But there was a huge lull of 5-6 years. Then after that, you saw actually the rise of this very charismatic militant leader, Burhan Wani, who actually came on social media. Everyone liked him, and then he was killed, and millions came on the streets. I mean, this is something which actually New Delhi does not understand, that, until and unless you actually resolve the conflict, until and unless you actually have the entire, scene in Kashmir Valley changed, nothing is going to happen. For example, Yasir Malik does not control the entire Kashmir Valley. Mirwais Umar Farooq or Mr. Geelani does not control the entire Kashmir Valley. They are actually, popular in their own segments. Geelani Sahab might be popular in both South and North Kashmir because he's considered to be this huge figure who never compromised and never had kind of dialogue with India. That's the reason, there is so much of following for him. Even if today, for example, if they allow him to come to Lal Chowk, I'm sure that you will have millions of people, because they have created a sense around him that he's this big leader who you cannot allow to come out of house, if you will. Because he was, he has been in house arrest for years now, and they don't allow him to come out of
essentially
house.
What you're saying is that the government of India doesn't seem to recognize or not want to accept that this movement is an indigenous movement not represented by one leader. And here I want to ask you, Mr. Sajjad, when you heard Mr. Sameer's take on it, do you agree that this movement has spread beyond political factions or organizations or representations by one person?
Exactly, that nobody is representing this movement. It's an indigenous movement and leaderless movement. Everyone is here now. If you ban Jamaat Islam, if you ban JK, and if you ban Hurriyat, you cannot expect that this movement would be stopped, because people are very known to the everything that is happening in Kashmir, because every day, every week we have here killings, we have here people are being blinded, because you cannot forget this when you are seeing this, all this is happening before your eyes, and you cannot expect that you can forget all these things. So if India is believing that by arresting any person in Jammu and Kashmir, they cannot take away the moment which is going in Jammu and Kashmir. I believe if India really wants to see a peaceful Jammu and Kashmir, they have to sit on table and they have to talk with all stakeholders, including Pakistan and the leadership of Jammu and Kashmir. And this is the only thing by which we can reach to the better destination.
Okay, thank you so much, Sajjad Lone, for your input there. Let me come back to you, Mr. Sameer. There is obviously this question that remains then, if leadership that represents Jammu and Kashmir, even if not wholly or is just a symbolic representation, if they are put behind bars, does that not create a vacuum? And the government of India must clearly know that, considering the circumstances that are in the world today in conflict zones, especially where there is a vacuum, you see extremist elements penetrate and take advantage of that.
That's what has happened in recent years. For example, Kashmiris, we are not religious fundamentalists, and we are not extremists at all. Our Islam, our kind of, the Islamic values have been, these are actually Sufi culture. For example, going to shrines, this is not a Middle Eastern medieval society. It's very modern, liberal. I think it's a very liberal society as compared to other Muslim societies at all. The thing is that, for example, if you look at Mr. Yasir Malik's detention, he was somebody who was actually a kind of mobilizer, if you will, among the Hurriyat conference. And he was somebody who would actually, the main center of this concept called JRL, Joint Resistance Leadership in Kashmir Valley. And they think by actually putting him in cage, by prisoning him before the elections, they would be able to solve all the problems, which unfortunately is not the case. The thing is, when you actually have this leadership vacuum, which has been prevalent from last many years now, you actually allow those elements who are like Islamic rabid fundamentalists, trying to take them on scene. For example, this huge rise of Zakir Musa, the person who actually swore his allegiance to ISIS once and Al Qaeda, and said that he once threatened Hurriyat leaders, saying that he will behead them in Lal Chowk. you actually allow those kinds of elements to take center stage and then try to say that, look, this is not about political dispute. This has nothing to do with Kashmir problem. This is actually Islamism. This is actually rabid jihadi Islamism, which I believe Kashmir is not. It's a political problem. It's a political dispute which has been there for decades between India and Pakistan, and let the Kashmiri people decide what they want to do. Even if you don't want to do that, let you give some kind of dialogue, let you institutionalize some kind of dialogue process, and then after that hold some, if you don't want to hold, if you say that the right to self-determination is an anarchic thing, it's actually which is absolute, cannot be done, but at least give some kind of political autonomies to Kashmir Valley. Instead of what has happened in the last 4 years is that the present regime in Delhi has humiliated even those people who were with it. For example, people who carried Indian flag in Kashmir Valley, people like Umar Abdullah and Mahbooba Mufti. These people were humiliated on television channels every evening, called pro-Pakistani leaders, pro-separatist leaders, jihadis, and whatnot by Indian television anchors. And ultimately what happened is the kind of hate which actually is against Kashmiri people in entire India.
Okay.
That's what you have seen in recent months when Kashmiris were attacked throughout Kashmir, throughout India.
Right, and hold that thought, Mr. Sabir. Let me welcome Analysts who's now joining us. Mr. Gowhar Geelani, you're a journalist and you're joining us from Srinagar. Welcome to Newswire. And as you heard a little bit of the debate that is going on is the creation of a vacuum. But before that, let me address something that continues to stand in the way. What does the BJP hope to achieve when it bans the leadership of whichever way it represents the people of Kashmir?
First of all, I just want to go back to what Samir was referring to. There's an interesting parallel. You have to see that Jammu Kashmir's Prime Minister, Sheikh Abdullah, when it was 1953, on 9th of August 1953, he was in Gulmarg. And as Prime Minister of Jammu and Kashmir, he was unceremoniously removed as Prime Minister. And not only that he was in 1958 of receiving funds from Pakistan. As a Prime Minister, the allegation was that he too was receiving funds from Pakistan. So my point is that it has been a consistent policy of Delhi whenever any Kashmiri has risen, whenever Kashmiri has expressed his or her opinion, he or she has been dubbed as a Pakistani agent. That is problem number one. So now coming to your question, why, what BJP aims to achieve with this kind of, stifling of dissent. It is, as Samir was also trying to point out, to the fact that it is actually wiping away the middle ground in Kashmir, wiping away the moderates who speak of dialogue, who talk about non-violence, who talk about resolving the Kashmir dispute without guns and pellets. So Mr. Yasir Malik represents that constituency. If you remember, in 1994, there was Irish Republican Army which offered a unilateral ceasefire in the Northern Ireland. On the same pattern, Mr. Yasir Malik's JKLF also offered a unilateral ceasefire.
But that doesn't work, right? That doesn't work for the BJP's narrative, because obviously if they were to agree to those conditions, what they would in turn see is a protest from those right-wing extremists that they're trying to get votes from.
Let me complete my thought. So I was referring to that this man, Yasir Malik, said that now I am on the Gandhian path, and he engaged with the Indian civil society, India's intelligentsia. He went and did a campaign which he referred to as the only democratic exercise that has happened in Jammu and Kashmir, which was the signature campaign, where 1.5 million signatures of ordinary Kashmiri men and women were collected and handed over to 150 embassies all over the world, including the then Indian Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh, and also Pakistani then President Mr. Musharraf. So this was a man who was conducting these signature campaigns and doing Safar Azadi, the journeys for freedom, asking people what is your role in the resolution process. When you also, kind of criminalize this political opinion and then ban, other socio-religious political parties, you are only making those relevant, which I think Samir was also referring to, who want to establish the caliphate, who are talking about establishing the caliphate, or who want to, blow themselves up in suicide car bombings. So then you actually want to talk to them, because you are just denying space to peaceful resolution. You are denying space to peaceful dissent. So it's a very, very dangerous game that the BJP is playing with an eye on the elections, upcoming general elections in India, because they want to sell this as something that we are being tough on Kashmiris, and they are doing to Kashmiris what the Nazi Hitler's regime did to the Jews during the Second World War. That's what is happening in Kashmir.
And it does not seem that the government of India, whether it's the BJP or the ones in the previous tenures, the fallout of promoting any such a point of view or any such sort of resurgence of extremism there, it does not seem that they are prepared, or are they, to afford that kind of reaction? Can they handle this filling up, a replacement of a peaceful political leadership with something which is much more extreme?
I think, Ayza, there are two Indias. Somebody says in Urdu that Bharat mein do Bharat baste hain. One is that the kind of ideology that the BJP and RSS and VHP, Vishwa Hindu Parishad, and Akhil Bharatiya Vidyarthi Parishad, these kind of organizations, Shiv Sena promote, who see India as a, as Hindu Rashtra, or they call it Akhand Bharat, where they see even Pakistan and Afghanistan and Bhutan and Nepal as part of larger India. And there is a sizable section of population which believes in the reincarnation of Lord Vishnu in Modi, Narendra Modi, who they see is somebody who will revive the lost Hindu pride. And they see Muslims, Pakistanis, Kashmiris as some people who have persecuted Hindus for over 8 centuries. But there is also another India, which, for example, other parties, the left parties, Communist Party of India, Trinamool Congress, or in the south, there are many parties, and even the Congress, who see India as some place where all faiths can coexist. And now this is a battle between which Bharat will actually remain, whether it is the BJP's Hindutva politics, Hindutva project that will sustain, or it is those Indians who believe in the Nehruvian idea of India, for example. So it is for the Indian voters to decide what kind of India they want for themselves and for the rest of the world.
So, right. And here I want to bring you back conversation, Mr. Sameer. While that is, of course, one big aspect of what we're seeing as a part of the indigenous movement within Indian-occupied Kashmir, there's also cases like the one responsible for the Pulwama attack. That individual, that young man, had a history of being abused and tortured by these very security forces. And while it is the most militarized zone in the world, he went undetected and took such extreme action. So there's obviously spurring on of violence as a result of these severe clamping down by the security forces.
I'm not sure about the torture and the, but I know a case, for example, his cousin Manzoor, who was killed 10 days before Burhan Wani died. He was already a militant, and then after 10 days, after 3 days, there was a protest in a place called Kohimo area, and he got a bullet in his leg, and he was staying in his home. I'm talking about Adil, the suicide bomber. He was staying in a house for almost 9 months, could not earn anything, and then after that finally went to a madrasa, was not settled there, came back, started working again. And then suddenly, I think it was 19th or 18th of March, he left with his cousin. Again, his name is Sameer. The Sameer is, while still active, Adil did the suicide bombing. But ultimately, you have to see, you don't have to see it like, like a person going and doing suicide bombing. You have to look at it through, for example, through different phases. Kashmir is not one single phase. These are multiple phases where you actually, what Adil saw when he arrived in the hostel on that day is actually something which actually everybody should know. For example, he arrived, when he was taken to the hostel on that day, 28 people had died. Just in 2 days, 28 people had died following the Burhan Wani's killing. This is the time when he got bullet in his leg. These are actually long stories told in for example, in different ways. But ultimately, what you have to understand is that today Kashmir is not in the hands of few leaders, for three, four political leaders. It's actually in the hands of those youth who are on the streets. Right. Those people who have been brought under the shadow of gun, who were born after 1990s, and those who had not seen Kashmir. It was never in peace in their entire lifetime. Right. And they say that why we are the targets. And this is not something that BJP government has understood. They actually see every problem in Kashmir through the prism of security. Okay. That we have to deal with bad guys, and we have to deal with militants, and the problem will solve.
I'm sorry, I'll have to cut you here. We've got the last 1 minute left. Thank you so much, Mr. Sameer here. Mr. Gowhar, I'm going to ask you the last question before we end this segment. Is somewhat of what he was saying, Mr. Sameer was also saying, what we're seeing is leadership being put behind bars or being harassed, their homes being raided. Now, that in effect for years on end has not shown any concrete change, or has it? I mean, you're living day and night in an area which is highly militarized. We are seeing right now the Indian Supreme Court trying to, hearing a case where the repealing of 35A is in question. I mean, is it the leadership really, or is it the general sentiment on the streets that is causing the unrest to spur out of control?
See, Ayza, even the Hurriyat Conference, both amalgams of Hurriyat Conference or JKLF or Joint Resistance Leadership, these are byproducts of the sentiment on the ground. It's not the other way around. You know, they are relevant because there is a sentiment on the ground for a political resolution. So that is the big question. I mean, these tactics have been tried before. There was Al-Fatah movement, there was Plebiscite Front movement, there were other movements led by Maqbool Bhatt and the rest. And you know, people come and go, leaders come and go, but this sentiment has prevailed over the last 7 decades. So you have to see the Kashmir story in its entirety. Even when India and Pakistan were not born as independent nation states, there was an uprising in Kashmir against the Dogra regime that started in the 1930s. So Kashmir has its own unique history, and it has its own unique, you know, kind of a sentiment which wants a political resolution of its
That's a really good point. I feel like it pretty much wraps up the debate here, that the representation, the leadership of the Indian occupied Kashmir people is the representation of the sentiment on the ground and not the other way around. Thank you so much, Mr. Gowhar Geelani, Mr. Sameer, for joining us. And with that, we're going to take a quick short break. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Now moving on to Afghanistan. An airstrike conducted by US military forces on the night of Friday to Saturday in Kunduz killed 13 civilians and injured 3 more, according to the preliminary findings of the UN assistance mission in Afghanistan. What is even more tragic is that out of these 13 killed, 10 were children from the same extended family. Not only were they from the same family, but they were refugees in their own land, having been internally displaced because of the fighting elsewhere in Afghanistan. Now, this incident has occurred close to Kunduz city during operations conducted by pro-government forces against the Taliban in the area. The Taliban have come out time and again saying these kind of attacks will just make us even more vengeful and we will come out stronger. So clearly it does not help in resolving the issue, especially when in contrast there are peace talks going on with the US. Now, 2018, which is last year, has already been declared the deadliest year ever since records have been kept in the Afghan conflict. According to a United Nations report released in February this year by the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan and the UN Human Rights Office, the report basically documents that over 10,000 civilian deaths took place in 2018, out of which almost 1,000 deaths were of children. Again, the highest number of children deaths recorded in this conflict zone. So, who is responsible for these deaths? Well, according to this report, 24% of the responsibility is going to the pro-government forces and 37% is attributed to the Taliban, while a significant amount is attributed to anti-government elements, which is basically like the Daesh or the ISIS. But the spike last year was essentially seen because of aerial strikes, something that we have again seen and which US, NATO forces on the ground in Afghanistan now say are investigating that how is it that 10 children were also killed part of this attack. So when it comes to collateral damage, which seems to be the excuse for any conflict zone, how can we justify in today's day and age where there is so much technology, so much surveillance and intelligence on the ground, that despite all of that, children's lives continue to be lost in a senseless ongoing conflict. For that, let's discuss with our panel. Yes, we have 2 journalists who are joining us from Afghanistan. One from Afghanistan, which is Mr. Zubair Babakarkhail. Welcome to Newswire. And also we have from Tehran, Ms. Fariba Pajooh. Thank you for joining us and giving us your time. Let me start with you, Mr. Zubair. This recent incident is pretty bad. Obviously, every death, every life matters. But 10 from the same extended family. We can't even imagine the suffering, the pain that this family must be going through. Is there going to be any accountability whatsoever?
Thank you. I would say this is not the only incident that happened a few days ago. At least once a week, we will have such a report that civilians were killed or wounded in some parts of Afghanistan. So, and after that, the government or the foreign forces, they will announce that they will investigate the issue and they will come with results. But so far, nothing has been changed, and we can see an increase in the civilian deaths every year, and also there were a few incidents. For example, when that American soldier went out, left his base in Kandahar some years ago, and went to a village and gunned down some family members in a village. That person was brought to justice in his own country, and some other soldiers in other countries, and some Afghans as well. But and overall, punishing those who had murdered or killed civilians in the military operations wasn't that big, which can bring a change. And still, we can see that civilians are targeted, not intentionally, I can say, but unintentionally, and they are also one of the victims of the current conflict in Afghanistan.
So, Ms. Faria, you heard our guest there, that something he said, highlight that obviously not intentionally target civilians, but you see, that's the whole point. The fight is between two different entities here, and who bears the loss and the brunt of it are the children, are the women, are the men who have nothing to do with the war, are just the unfortunate participants or the nationals of that specific country. Do you see that today's day and age justifies, allows this kind of warfare that continues to take an unprecedented number of lives of children and women and innocent men?
Thank you for having me. Actually, it's very sad story, and yeah, I want to say there is no any justification for killing children and innocent people. When the international forces has this ability to monitor all details in the area if they want to do that. I remember, as my friend mentioned about the Kunduz 2 years ago, I remember they even attacked to the place of Doctors Without Borders in Kunduz 2 years ago, and at least they didn't even they just said that we are gonna search about it, and we will publish the results, but there is no result after the investigate about that happened in Kunduz. But at least I can say that at the time President Obama apologized for that happened in Kunduz. Mr. Deborah Richardson, the spokesman of American forces, he just blamed the Taliban and said we attacked that place and we killed more than 13 civilians because Taliban were hiding there. It does not make sense.
No, you're right. It does not make sense, especially considering they have given so much importance to the Taliban in bringing them to the negotiating table, in bending over backward almost, it seems, to get them to agree to a peace agreement. Mr. Zubair, is it too critical or cynical for us to comment on this and say, well, the US wants to get out of this mess that they have created because they cannot sustain it any longer?
No, I mean, no one can be reluctant. There is freedom of speech. Everyone can say whatever they think of. And I can say, I mean, I still won't agree that the Americans only has created tension in Afghanistan, made this chaos in Afghanistan, and now only wants to live. If we go back to 2002 and see that Afghanistan and compare that with now, there has been, like, we can say it, an overnight change in Afghanistan. Though we have these problems still, the war against terror is going on. The civilians get harmed at least once a week. We are the largest opium production country in Afghanistan, in the world. But the Afghanistan that was in 2002, it was totally destroyed by the civil war and the Russian invasion, and then during the Taliban regime, that they couldn't build a single road in Afghanistan. So there was a huge change, development, economically, education, health, and that. So,
well,
it short,
I'm sorry, Mr. Zubair, let me play the devil's advocate here. And Fariba, I welcome you to jump in anytime. When you say that, and as I understand, indicating that the US had a big role to play in the reconstruction, I agree, they did have but let's not absolve them of responsibility completely. Let's not forget the carpet bombing that they did while the Taliban continued in last-ditch efforts to try and invite them to have a conversation about handing over bin Laden. I mean, that was something that, of course, is easily forgotten and brushed aside. It wasn't that complete resistance of handing over bin Laden, but an invitation to have that talk, but they went ahead and took the the typical way that they do, strong arming it. Ms. Fariba, do you agree that that the US is trying to withdraw as fast as it can for its own sake and leaving behind a very fragile political situation within Afghanistan?
Actually, I want to say, if you want to talk about 2002 and at the time where Taliban were there, and maybe Afghanistan needs to I'm not sure about the attack, but Afghanistan needs Taliban leave the country. But I mean, we cannot close our eyes that good things American did in Afghanistan. But the things I want to emphasize on it is that actually I wrote about this. Now the government, the American government, don't have, and especially President Trump, he doesn't have any clear plan for Afghanistan. One day he is talking to leave the Afghanistan, and the day after he is talking to stay in Afghanistan. I mean, there is no clear plan for Afghanistan after 17 years war in there. So, and also, as I know that he has two people around himself, General McMaster and General Mattis, McMaster and Mattis. But now now he doesn't have them with himself. I mean, I think American doesn't have any plan, even right. For the peace deals, they don't have any plan. So
not having a plan is one debate also. And here I'd like to welcome someone else who's joining us, Mr. Khairullah Shinwari. You're a human rights activist. You're joining us from Kabul. Thank you so much for being here on Newswire. The debate really is, while these differences continue, while the conflict continues on the ground, which almost seems as if what happens in Afghanistan with the Taliban is a completely different Taliban, and those Taliban who are speaking with the US on a peace deal is a completely different entity. But we don't want to get into that. We want to talk more about the death count here. 2018, according to the UN report, was the deadliest for not just civilians, children. Over 3,000 were affected, children alone, and out of that 927 kids died. I mean, where is the international community when it comes to human rights, when it comes to the price that these civilians have to pay?
Thank you very much. Since 18 years of U.S. invasion in Afghanistan, the human rights violation is in progress, especially in the last 6 months with starting peace negotiations. The violence increased in all over Afghanistan, especially in rural areas a lot. So we have noticed much more bombings, airstrikes, and night raids targeting civilian people, destroying their homes, mosques, and villages, which is totally a war crime. So we are calling up on both sides to pay their full attention to war crimes, to the civilian casualties in the war. And it's time to go for a peace talk, and it's time to end all this dispute.
And this report, I just want to quickly refer to it for our viewers. 2009, the recorded number of deaths of children was around 307. And now 10 years later, we are seeing this number having tripled. And like you mentioned, the past 6 months have been even more deadly for the civilians there. This incident that has taken place near the Kunduz city, where 10 of the same family, 10 children of the same extended family have died. Now, something Mr. Zubair said, this is almost like a weekly basis incident. But where do we step in? Where does the world step in? How do we highlight this? How do we bring accountability into this? This is a massive human rights violation.
I think the international community should take note of all this is going on from the governmental forces in the international troops which are operating in here, in all sides actually. So they need to take a look at this. They need to call up on all sides to calm down and reduce what is going on in here in the country. People are suffering. We as people need peace. We are going for peace. This is totally a wrong practice on our people. We condemning all these acts of violence by both sides.
Of course. So, Mr. Shinwari, tell me something more that if you could highlight for us, besides deaths that take place from unexploded ordnance or from airstrikes, etc., or just fighting. There are, of course, other reasons for the damages that happen. There are children who become handicapped. If you could highlight some more of what this, the fallout is of this war on the children and the women of Afghanistan.
Yes, I've mentioned it to your attention that it is all because of the current war which we are in. So people are dying, civilians are dying, especially children and women are dying. We request the both sides to stop all this. This is totally a war crime, targeting people, targeting civilians, targeting women and children especially. This is a war crime. They need to stop this immediately, as soon as they can, because it's a war crime. Everyone is sad about this in here. We need to stop this.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Shinwari. Ms. Fariba, you've been a journalist in Afghanistan. You've reported from the ground. Have you come across these families, these women, these children who have been the direct victims of this conflict?
They injured, the women and children. I met them face to face. And last October, I've been in Afghanistan. I covered the ICRC work in Kabul, and I met the little children and I met the women without legs and without hands. They just injured by the bombs comes from the Afghan government or the international forces, and it was super heartbreaking for me. I mean, if you feel their feelings and their pain, it's real. It's really heartbreaking, I can say.
It's really heartbreaking indeed. One can't imagine the pain they go through. Thank you so much, Ms. Fariba, Mr. Zubair and Mr. Shinwari for joining us here on Newswire. And as the situation develops, of course, you can rely on Indus News to keep you abreast of what is happening in Afghanistan and elsewhere in the world. But unfortunately, we've run out of time here on Newswire. I will see you tomorrow. Till then, goodbye.